fact, the average U.S. tariff rate on the world has jumped from just over 2% at the end of last year to almost 16%, 8 times higher. 16% currently.
Imagine North America, where trade cards are being reshuffled before our very eyes. Under Donald Trump's leadership, the US is once again betting on tariffs, promising to bring manufacturing back home. But the result is quite different. Instead of creating jobs in Detroit and Ohio, new factory lines are opening across the border. Canada and Mexico, which for many years remained in the shadow of the American economic agenda, are now beginning to build their own alliances and seize the moment while Washington is preoccupied with internal crises.
Specifically, under the new U.S. approach, countries must now buy access to the world's largest economy through a combination of tariffs, investments, unilateral trade liberalization, and policy changes in their home markets.
Trump calls tariffs shields against America's transformation into a third world country. His administration is collecting hundreds of billions of dollars, and slogans about bringing back jobs are being heard across the country. But what if these same tariffs turn out to be an anchor dragging the economy down? What if measures designed to protect industry make goods more expensive, undermine competitiveness, and force companies to look for new ways to survive? History shows that tough barriers rarely bring stability, especially when the domestic market is overheated and global supply chains are changing faster than politicians can respond. Against this backdrop, Canada is playing its own game. Statistics show economic decline and rising unemployment, but instead of making loud threats, Canada is betting on diplomacy and strategic alliances. That is why the Prime Minister's visit to Mexico was much more than a formal photo opportunity. It is a signal Ottawa and Mexico City are ready to coordinate their positions ahead of the decisive review of the KUSMA agreement in 2026. Recall the last round of negotiations, when Mexico secretly shared information with Canada to help it resist pressure from the White House. At that time, this made it possible to soften tariffs on steel and aluminum. Could a similar alliance shift the balance of power again? Meanwhile, one of the symbols of the American auto industry is preparing for an unexpected move. Ford is relocating production of its iconic pickup trucks to Canada. This decision was made even before the new tariffs, but it was the tariff war that made it truly profitable. While factories in the US are facing rising costs and the threat of mass layoffs, Canada is getting thousands of new jobs and billions in investment. The irony is that a policy designed to revive the American states is actually strengthening its neighbors.
Those were quickly followed by reciprocal tariffs on every U.S. trade partner and very high sectoral tariffs applied globally on strategic industries, including steel, aluminum, autos, and copper.
But the main intrigue lies ahead. In 2026, the countries must decide what the future of North American trade will look like. Will the everyman for himself game continue under Washington's dictates, or will Canada and Mexico build a new center of power, using their access to Pacific markets and mutual support? And what will happen to America if the courts rule the tariff program illegal and demand the return of hundreds of billions of dollars? The North American map is changing right now. The US risks drowning in its own tariffs, while Canada and Mexico have a chance to dictate terms for the first time in decades. This situation could overturn the perception of who really controls trade on the continent. The only question is who will emerge victorious from this economic duel. At the beginning of autumn in North America, the situation is more reminiscent of a chess game several moves ahead. At first glance, it seems that the United States holds all the keys: the continent's largest economy, a huge market, and a president who confidently relies on tariffs as the main instrument of economic policy. But behind the scenes, processes are underway that paint a different picture. Canada and Mexico, Washington's two closest partners in the KUSMA agreement, understand that their future depends not so much on Trump's decisions as on their ability to act together. Already today, they are forming the basis for a potential alliance that could limit American pressure and even turn it to their own advantage. When the Canadian Prime Minister traveled to Mexico, the press initially treated the visit as routine diplomacy. But there are no coincidences in diplomacy, especially when a revision of the trade agreement that sets the rules for an entire continent looms on the horizon. The meeting with the Mexican leadership was a demonstration of a new course. Canada no longer intends to be a passive observer in the shadow of the US. It is important to remember that relations between the two countries have not always been smooth. Several years ago, Canadian provincial politicians accused Mexico of dumping and driving workers out of the north. At the time, these statements were perceived as humiliating in Mexico City. Restoring trust proved difficult. It was all the more impressive that the parties decided to start with a clean slate, openly acknowledging past mistakes and moving towards common interests.
And to these ends, the United States has announced a series of trade actions. Those began near the start of this year with the so-called IEEPA tariffs against Canada and Mexico based on U.S. concerns about the border and fentanyl trafficking.
The negotiations discussed not only the future of KUSMA, but also the possibility of creating a bilateral coordination mechanism that had never existed before. In the closed part of the meeting, the idea of a so-called Trade Risk Council was discussed, which would meet quarterly and develop positions in advance on key issues related to U.S. tariffs. This initiative has not yet been officially confirmed, but sources in both capitals say that documents on its creation could be signed before the end of the year. If this happens for the first time in the history of North American integration, there will be a body capable of establishing a common line between the two countries without looking to Washington. Past experience shows that such steps can be effective. During the most difficult NAFTA negotiations, it was cooperation with Mexico that helped Canada avoid the worst-case scenarios. Back in 2018, Mexican negotiators secretly shared information about the White House's strategy, allowing Ottawa to develop counter-arguments and protect its interests in steel and aluminum issues. Now, as Washington prepares new conditions and threatens another revision of the rules, Canada and Mexico understand that only by acting in tandem can they prevail. But it's not just about negotiations. Already we can see attempts by the US to divide the two neighbors. The Trump administration's recent decision to give Mexico a 90-day reprieve on new tariffs is a classic example of the divide and rule strategy. While Mexico City is getting temporary relief for cars, steel, and copper, Canada finds itself in a less favorable position. This creates the tension that Washington is counting on, weakening the alliance and forcing countries to compete with each other for concessions. But the Prime Minister's visit to Mexico showed the opposite. Instead of giving in to the temptation to seek individual benefits, both sides emphatically stressed that no reprieve is worth destroying trust.
This new U.S. trade policy has several motivations: to raise tariff revenues, to protect strategic industries, to encourage foreign investment in the United States, and to change trade and non-trade policy in U.S. partners.
Of course, the negotiations were not easy. Mexican leaders reminded their Canadian counterparts that Canadian mining companies must comply with strict environmental standards. This issue is not new. It has poisoned relations for decades. According to Mexican media reports, about a third of all complaints about foreign companies are related to Canadian firms which allegedly violated standards and left behind destroyed ecosystems. Ottawa knows that this signal cannot be ignored. Therefore, the idea of creating a joint environmental commission to monitor the activities of investors was discussed behind the scenes. But what is even more important is that both sides have begun to talk about jointly entering markets outside North America. Here, Canada and Mexico have a trump card: their membership in the Trans-Pacific Partnership. By withdrawing from this agreement under Donald Trump, the US effectively gave its neighbors the opportunity to coordinate supplies to Asia and use shared access to fast-growing markets. Negotiations in Mexico City focused on how to combine production capacities, for example, assembling cars in Mexico and supplying components from Canada in order to jointly enter Japan and South Korea without tariff barriers. The situation is further exacerbated by growing economic instability in the United States itself. The unemployment rate reached 4.3% in August 2025, the highest level in 4 years. The Federal Reserve has already been forced to cut interest rates, acknowledging the weakness of the labor market. Economists are openly warning of the risk of stagflation, a combination of slow growth and high import costs due to tariffs. For Canada and Mexico, this is a signal that they cannot rely on the US economy as a guarantor of stability. That is why the Prime Minister's visit took on special symbolic significance. It became part of a strategy to protect against turbulence from their southern neighbor.
As a result of these developments, the breadth and the depth of the changes in U.S. trade policy have become more fully apparent.
There are also less obvious elements to this strategic rapprochement. According to unconfirmed reports, Joint investments in the creation of rare earth metal storage facilities were discussed. The talk was about building infrastructure that would allow countries to control the supply of lithium and copper, which are in demand in the electric vehicle industry. If such a project is implemented, it could become a real lever of pressure on the US, because in the context of tariffs and rising prices, it is access to raw materials that determines who wins the race. Washington understands this and is therefore acting preemptively. Sources in the White House hint that the administration is preparing new measures aimed at restricting supplies from Mexico under the pretext of protecting national security. If these plans are implemented, the alliance between the two countries will come under even greater pressure. But that is precisely why coordination is so important today. Each country individually is unlikely to be able to withstand the pressure, but together they have a chance to dictate their terms, at least in certain areas. Thus, the first steps taken by Canada and Mexico towards closer cooperation can already be seen as a response to the US strategy. The visit to Mexico showed that Ottawa and Mexico City are ready not only to smooth over past grievances, but also to build a system of protection against pressure from Washington. They remember the lessons of past negotiations. They see how the Trump administration is trying to drive a wedge between them. And they understand that in 2026 the stakes will be higher than ever. At stake are not just tariffs and trade barriers. At stake is the very model of North American integration. And right now, it is being decided whether this model will continue to depend exclusively on the US, or whether Canada and Mexico will find a way to create their own center of power.
In a positive and very important development earlier this month, just a few weeks ago, the United States reaffirmed a core commitment to our free trade agreement, KUSMA, by reinforcing that those Canadian exports to the United States that are compliant with that agreement, that are compliant with KUSMA, will not be subject to U.S. IEEPA tariffs.
The 2026 review of the KUSMA agreement is a moment that could completely change the logic of North American trade. Unlike past negotiations, where the US was the undisputed leader and imposed conditions, today the context is different. The world no longer looks the same as it did 10 years ago, and global supply chains have been restructured. Against the backdrop of a tariff war, a weakening US economy, and slowing growth in China, Canada and Mexico have a chance to use new leverage. This opportunity is directly linked to their participation in the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which the US abandoned during the Trump administration. Now, the two northern neighbors have access to the largest Asian markets, which the US cannot directly enter without bilateral agreements. It is this circumstance that could turn the upcoming KUSMA review from a formal procedure into a battleground for the future of the continent. According to analysts, if Canada and Mexico manage to agree on a strategy, they will be able to offer an alternative trade architecture, where the US will play not a dominant role, but only one of many. Technical consultations are already underway on how to synchronize tariff concessions and rules of origin so that joint production chains provide a competitive advantage in the markets of Japan, South Korea, and Australia. Experts are even discussing a scenario in which Canada and Mexico would create a joint fund to support exporters to Asia, allowing them to finance logistics and insurance for shipments. There is no official confirmation, but the idea itself shows how seriously the possibility of moving beyond the familiar model, where everything revolves around Washington, is being considered. Meanwhile, the situation in the US is making the White House's position increasingly vulnerable. The labor market is showing worrying signs: rising unemployment, fewer job openings, and declining business confidence and investment. Economists are increasingly using the word stagflation, emphasizing that the combination of tariffs, expensive loans, and falling consumer demand could lead to stagnation. In these conditions, Washington's bargaining power is declining. Whereas Trump could previously threaten his neighbors with breaking agreements and be confident that they would make concessions for access to the American market, they now have room for maneuver. Canada and Mexico can rely not only on each other, but also on Europe, which is actively seeking new channels of cooperation after energy crises and geopolitical conflicts.
As in previous trade disputes, Canada has implemented a series of retaliatory tariffs. Their objectives have been to protect Canadian workers and businesses and to incentivize a negotiated settlement with the United States. Few other countries followed suit.
For Canada, this opens up the possibility of diversifying its economy. Recent years have shown how dangerous dependence on a single market can be. More than 70% of Canadian exports still go to the US. But statistics also show that it is this dependence that makes the economy vulnerable. The second half of 2025 brought Canada a 1.5% decline in GDP, and the unemployment rate exceeded 7%. In such a situation, any increase in pressure from Washington could trigger a deeper recession. Therefore, the focus is on expanding ties with Europe and Mexico, which should reduce the impact of American decisions. It is important to understand that this is not just about trade agreements on paper, but also about real investments and infrastructure. Ottawa is actively discussing a project to build a new transatlantic transport corridor. The idea is to create a direct logistics line between the ports of Eastern Canada and Northern Europe, bypassing the traditional routes through the east coast of the US. According to estimates by the Ministry of Transport, if the project is implemented, it will increase trade with the EU by 20% within the first 3 years. At the same time, the possibility of expanding the rail networks connecting Canada with Mexico via the central states of the US is being considered. So far, this idea seems too ambitious, given the political atmosphere in Washington, but the fact that it is being discussed demonstrates the direction of thinking to be less dependent on American rules and to create more of its own alternatives. Mexico also sees benefits in this process. For Mexico, Canada is becoming not only an investor, but also a channel for access to the European market, where Mexican goods face barriers. For example, joint production of agricultural products using Canadian technologies and their subsequent certification for export to the EU is being discussed. This scheme would allow Mexico to circumvent some of the restrictions and gain access to new niches. In return, Mexico is ready to offer Canada more favorable conditions for participation in its energy projects, especially in the field of renewable energy, where foreign investment is in high demand.
The United States has also imposed substantial trade actions on the Canadian lumber industry. Now, in recent weeks, the United States has agreed a series of trade deals with a variety of countries. And these deals have several aspects in common. First, baseline tariffs that cover a broad range of goods and services that are substantially higher than those U.S. tariffs that existed before.
When all these elements are taken together, it becomes clear that Canada's strategy is not so much a reaction to pressure from the U.S. as an attempt to build a long-term system of sustainability. They understand that Washington may change course after the election, but the structure of trade does not change instantly. This means that only diversification and the creation of real alternative channels can protect the economy from shocks. This explains the soft tone with which the Canadian leadership speaks about Trump. Unlike the American leaders' loud statements, Ottawa is betting on patience and careful steps so as not to destroy the existing trade framework, where 85% remains duty-free, but at the same time preparing the ground for future alliances. In Canadian expert circles, comparisons are increasingly being made with the situation in Europe, where countries have created integration mechanisms to reduce their dependence on dominant players. Direct analogies are, of course, impossible, but the logic is clear: to build a structure that will work even under pressure from the US. According to estimates by the Institute for International Economics, if Canada and Mexico implement at least half of the initiatives under discussion, by 2030 the US share of their combined trade could fall to 55%. This is still a high figure, but much safer than the current numbers. Thus, the upcoming review of KUSMA in 2026 becomes not just a procedure for updating a trade agreement, but a moment of truth. The US is trying to maintain control by relying on tariffs and threats, but its position is weakening. Canada and Mexico, on the other hand, see this as an opportunity to build new lines of cooperation, both between themselves and with other regions. Canada is betting on diversification, expanding ties with Europe, and using trans-Pacific mechanisms. Mexico is looking for new markets and is ready to bargain for access to its resources in exchange for investment and political support. At stake is not only the fate of specific industries, but also the very model of North American integration, where for the first time in decades the US risks losing its role as the sole center of power.
Those trade deals with other countries also have limited or no relief from those sectoral tariffs in those strategic industries such as steel and autos. They include substantial commitments by the U.S. trade partners for investments in the United States and significant unilateral trade liberalization measures by U.S. trade partners.
And that is what makes today's steps by Ottawa and Mexico City so important. Their strategy already goes beyond current problems. They are thinking in terms of decades. While Washington is trying to win the next round of the tariff war, Canada and Mexico are laying the groundwork to dictate the rules in the future, not only on the continent but also in conjunction with the largest economies in Asia and Europe. And the closer we get to 2026, the more obvious it becomes that the map of North America could be redrawn in the most unexpected way.